Welcome to a brand new deep dive. We are so glad you are here with us today.
Yeah, really glad to be doing this one.
If you are looking for a shortcut to being incredibly well-informed without having to, wade through a mountain of really dense textbooks, you are in exactly the right place.
Definitely.
Today, our sources are, well, they're incredibly visual. We are looking at a highly organized, beautifully handwritten set of study notes for biology, specifically covering the entire animal kingdom.
Which is a massive topic.
It is, and it's essentially this masterclass on how biologists organize life on Earth.
It really is a masterful piece of synthesis. Because, at first glance, you might see this and think, it's just rote memorization for a taxonomy exam.
Right, just lists of words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you look closer at the sequence of these concepts, what you're actually looking at is the grand blueprint of evolution. It is the story of how life encountered the fundamental problems of survival, eating, moving, reproducing, and solved them in wildly different, sometimes really bizarre ways.
And right on the very first page of these notes, there's a sticky note, a handwritten expert tip that caught my eye immediately. It says that 60% of questions come from the basis of classification.
That is a crucial tip.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to decode those foundational rules for you. We are going to trace this evolutionary blueprint sequentially, starting with the most basic question possible. What actually makes an animal?
Right. Where do we draw the line?
The notes lay out the core traits. You have to be multicellular, heterotrophic, meaning you can't make your own food, holozoic, and eukaryotic. Plus, you need the ability to move and possess neurons or sense organs.
But biology wouldn't be biology without exceptions.
Of course not.
The very first organism we encounter breaks those rules immediately.
Yes. The sponges, under phylum Porifera, they are classified as animals, but they are sessile.
Meaning they are completely stuck to one spot.
Right. They cannot move at all, and they have absolutely zero neurons or sense organs.
Yeah.
Which makes me wonder, if they can't move or feel, how are they fundamentally different from a plant? Why do biologists insist they are animals?
It's a great question, and it really comes down to their cellular mechanics and their evolutionary lineage.
Okay.
They don't have cell walls like plants do, and they are completely heterotrophic. They cannot photosynthesize.
Ah, so they have to eat.
Exactly. They rely on engulfing food particles from the water around them. They are essentially the absolute baseline of animal life, operating just barely above a colony of independent cells.
Wow.
And this brings us to the underlying philosophy of classification that the notes highlight. By grouping organisms based on these shared fundamental traits, we don't have to study every single species from scratch.
Like the ant and cockroach analogy in the text.
Spot on. If you know the baseline rules for a phylum, you can accurately predict the biological behaviors of almost everything in it.
So, if we are going to build this biological blueprint from the ground up, the notes start on page 3 with the levels of organization.
Which is a clear sequential upgrade in complexity.
Right. At the absolute bottom, you have the cellular level. That's our rule-breaking porifera, the sponges, which are, as you said, essentially just loose cells working together. Step up one level, and you get tissue, where cells with the same function actually coordinate.
That covers Coelomate and Ctenophora.
Then the architecture gets more sophisticated. We step up to the organ level, where tissues are grouped together into distinct functional units. That is where the platyhelminthes, or flatworms, sit.
And finally, the pinnacle of this particular metric, the organ system level, where organs work together in complex networks.
This covers everything from Acoelomanthes all the way up to chordates, which includes us.
Along with how cells are organized, we also have to look at the geometry of the body. Symmetry.
Right, the shapes.
Yeah.
If you are asymmetrical, like a sponge, you have no predictable shape.
None at all.
But radial symmetry, like a starfish, means any central plane makes equal halves. You can cut it like a pie.
And bilateral symmetry, like a human, means only one specific plane makes equal left and right halves.
But the notes highlight a massive shape-shifting exception here with the echinoderms.
Yes, the phylum that includes the starfish. Their adult forms have radial symmetry, but their larval forms actually start out with bilateral symmetry.
That's so weird.
They fundamentally reorganize their entire body geometry as they mature. It's an incredible adaptation that allows the larvae to swim directionally and disperse widely across the ocean, while the adults settle into a multidirectional, sensory-rich lifestyle on the seafloor.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we look past the outside shape and dive into the internal machinery on page 4, the notes detail germ layers.
Very important concept.
When an animal is just an embryo, it develops layers of tissue. Diploblastic animals have two layers, an outer ectoderm and an inner endoderm.
Separated by a jelly-like substance called mesoglia.
Right, but triploblastic animals get a crucial upgrade. A third middle layer called the mesoderm.
And we really cannot overstate the evolutionary importance of that mesoderm. It is the absolute prerequisite for the next major leap in the notes, the coelom.
The body cavity.
Exactly. The coelom is a cavity lined entirely by mesoderm tissue. It's essentially the designated space where your internal organs sit.
The notes show this progression perfectly. First, acoelomates, like the flatworms, they have no cavity at all. They're just solid tissue all the way through.
Very restrictive.
Then you get the pseudocoelomates, where the cavity exists, but it isn't fully lined by mesoderm. It's scattered in pouches.
Right.
Finally, the eucoelomates, meaning true cavity. These animals have a fully formed mesoderm-lined space. But practically speaking, why does having this empty space matter so much for an animal's survival?
Think of it as biological shock absorption and mechanical freedom.
Oh, I like that.
A true coelom allows internal organs to grow, twist, and function completely independently of the outer body wall.
Ah, so they aren't glued together.
Right. It's the reason your digestive tract can actively churn food, or your beating heart can pump vigorously without causing your entire outer skin to ripple and flex with every movement. It decoupled internal function from external locomotion.
That is a brilliant way to picture it. So, moving to page 5, the final piece of this foundational blueprint involves segmentation and the notochord.
There is true metamerism, where the body is divided internally and externally into repeated functional units.
The notes specifically point out human ribs alongside earthworms as examples of this. I never thought of my ribs as being like an earthworm.
It's the same evolutionary principle. Then there is pseudo-segmentation, like a tapeworm, which just looks sectioned on the outside.
And then we reach the ultimate dividing line in the animal kingdom, the notochord.
Yes. It is a mesodermally derived, rod-like support structure found on the dorsal side during embryonic development.
This single structure splits everything. If you possess it at any point in your life, you are a chordate. If you don't, you are a non-chordate, which is everything from Porifera to hemichordata.
With those rules firmly established, the notes start walking us through the actual phyla on page 6, starting with the simplest. We are back to phylum Porifera, the sponges.
We know they are asymmetrical and cellular, but their survival relies entirely on an incredible water transport system. Water flows in through tiny pores called ostia, enters a central cavity called the spongicle, and gets pushed out the top through the osculum.
The real engines of that system are specialized cells called choanocytes, or collar cells.
Right.
They literally beat tiny flagella to create the water current that pulls microscopic food into the sponge, and they are supported by a skeleton of Schurp spicules.
A great example highlighted in the text is spongilla, and it has an exclamation mark next to it because it is a rare freshwater sponge, completely breaking the mold of its mostly marine relatives.
Nature loves an exception. Moving up the complexity ladder on the same page, we hit phylum Coelenterata, or Cnidaria.
Their defining feature is right in the name, cnidoblasts. These are actual microscopic harpoons, stinging cells used to capture prey and defend themselves.
But what really stands out are their two body forms.
Yes, you have the sessile polyp, like the hydra, and the free-swimming medusa, like a jellyfish.
And what's truly fascinating is how some of these organisms, like Obelia, utilize both. It's a strategy called metagenesis, or alternation of generations.
Meaning they switch back and forth.
Exactly. They literally alternate between the stationary polyp form, which reproduces asexually, and the swimming medusa form, which reproduces sexually.
That is wild.
It is a dual-pronged biological strategy. The polyp ensures stable, rapid local growth, while the medusa allows them to disperse their genetics across vast ocean distances.
Page 7 brings us right next to them. Phylum Ctenophora, the cone jellies. They use 8 external rows of ciliated cone plates to glide through the water, but their standout trait is bioluminescence.
Species like Pleurobrachia emit their own light,
which in the deep ocean is a crucial tool for startling predators who are attracting prey.
From those glowing ocean drifters, we shift to a much more intense survival strategy with phylum Platyhelminthes, the flatworms.
Right, because they are bilateral acoelomates, meaning they lack that internal body cavity we talked about. Their bodies are severely restricted.
They are dorso-ventrally flattened to ensure every single cell is close to the surface for gas exchange.
And that restricted anatomy pushes them toward a very specific lifestyle. They're mostly endoparasites, living entirely inside other animals.
They even have dedicated hooks and suckers to anchor themselves inside a host's digestive tract.
To manage their internal fluid balance, they use these amazing structures called flame cells. Tamenia, the tapeworm, is the classic example here.
But the notes also mention planaria, which has an almost supernatural power of regeneration.
You can essentially cut a planaria into pieces, and each piece grows a new head and tail.
Continuing with the worms on page 8, we encounter Phylum Aschelminthes, the roundworms. Crucially, these are our first pseudocoelomates.
That false cavity gives them enough internal space to develop a complete alimentary canal with a muscular pharynx.
We also see clear sexual dimorphism here. The females are distinctly longer and straighter, while the males are shorter with a sharply curved tail.
Ascaris is a prime example of that. Then we have phylum Annelida, the segmented worms. Annulus translates to little ring, which perfectly describes their true metamerism. How do they actually move compared to the flatworms?
They utilize a combination of longitudinal and circular muscles, creating a wave-like peristalsis to burrow through soil.
And some aquatic versions, like Nereis, take it a step further with lateral appendages called parapodia that act almost like tiny paddles for swimming.
For managing waste, they utilize coiled tubes called nephridia. Earthworms and leeches fall into this group.
That brings us to page 9 and the undisputed heavyweights of the animal kingdom, phylum Arthropoda. They make up a staggering 2/3 of all named species on Earth.
It is an empire.
Truly, arthro means jointed, and poda means appendages. But why exactly are jointed legs and a chitinous exoskeleton such a dominant evolutionary combination?
It's the ultimate biological armor combined with precision mobility. The exoskeleton prevents water loss, which allowed them to absolutely conquer terrestrial environments, while the jointed appendages provided immense leverage for running, jumping, and manipulating food. It's an incredibly adaptable framework.
And you can see that adaptability in how diverse their internal systems are. To breathe, insects use a tracheal system. Prawns use gills. Spiders use book lungs.
And then there's the limulus, the king crab.
Which uses book gills and is famously labeled right here in the notes as a living fossil.
Because limulus has survived multiple mass extinctions, remaining virtually unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, its biological design is just that resilient.
As for the rest of the arthropods, the examples in the notes remind us how deeply they impact us. We rely on Apis, the honeybee, and Bombyx, the silkworm, but we also battle disease vectors like Anopheles mosquitoes and devastating crop pests like Leucista.
Next, on page 10, the notes transition to the softer side of life with Phylum Mollusca.
The second largest phylum. They are unsegmented animals with soft bodies, typically protected by a calcareous shell. Their anatomy is distinctly divided into a head, a visceral hump containing the organs, and a muscular foot for movement.
A standout feature of the mollusks is the mantle cavity, housing feather-like gills that pull double duty for both respiration and excretion.
But their most unique feeding tool is the radula.
Oh, the radula is fascinating.
It's essentially a biological file. Conveyor belt of microscopic teeth used to rasp away at algae or bore into other shells. Phyla, the apple snail, and Pictata, the pearl oyster, are great examples of this diversity.
Which leads us to Phylum Echinodermata, the spiny-skinned marine animals. We touched on their shape-shifting symmetry earlier, but the notes place a massive red box around their true superpower, the water vascular system.
How does this system actually function?
What's fascinating here is you can think of it as a complex network of hydraulic brakes and pumps. Yes. They pull seawater into a central ring and channel it down their arms into hundreds of tiny tube feet. By regulating the water pressure in those feet, they can pry open clamshells, suction themselves to rocks to withstand crashing waves, and even absorb oxygen directly from the water.
So Ascarius, the starfish, relies completely on this hydraulic pressure to survive.
Entirely.
Moving along to page 11, we hit a bit of taxonomic drama with Phylum Hemichordata.
The half-chordates.
Yes. They are worm-like marine creatures, like Balanoglossus, with bodies divided into a proboscis, collar, and trunk. The notes explicitly mention they used to be considered full chordates, but they got demoted. Why did they lose their status?
They got demoted because modern genetic and structural analysis revealed they don't actually possess a true notochord.
Oh, wow.
To be a member of the elite phylum Chordata, you must unequivocally meet the big 4 rules outlined in the text. Number 1, a true notochord. Number 2, a dorsal hollow single nerve cord. Number 3, pharyngeal gill slits. And number 4, a post-anal tail.
If you miss any of those in your developmental life cycle, you're out of the club.
Exactly.
That sets the stage perfectly on page 12 for the protochordates, which are the earliest evolutionary iterations of this design. They are exclusively marine and split into two fascinating subphyla. First, Chordata, the tunicates.
According to the notes, they only possess a notochord in their larval tail.
Right. When they become adults, they lose it entirely and encase themselves in a leathery tunic.
And this is where we encounter one of the most mind-bending biological strategies in the entire text: retrogressive metamorphosis.
Okay, what does that mean?
Normally, we think of metamorphosis as an upgrade, a hungry caterpillar turning into a highly mobile, complex butterfly.
Right.
But the Chordata flipped the script. They start as a highly active, swimming larva with a distinct nervous system and notochord.
This is pretty advanced.
It is. But to become an adult, they settle onto a rock, digest their own brain and tail, and transform into a sessile, stationary filter feeder. They actively simplify their existence.
Wait, so it actually gets less complex as it grows. It essentially devolves.
Exactly. It sheds its biological overhead. Maintaining a complex nervous system and a mobile body requires massive amounts of energy. By permanently attaching to a rock and just filtering water, the tunicate drastically lowers its caloric needs.
It's an incredibly successful survival strategy disguised as a step backward.
Contrast that with the other protochordate, cephalochordata, like the lancelet. They take the opposite approach, retaining their notochord from head to tail for their entire life.
Which finally brings us to page 13 and the vertebrates. The notes feature a fantastic clarifying quote. All vertebrates are chordates, but not all chordates are vertebrates.
Because in this subphylum, that embryonic notochord is fully replaced by a bony or cartilaginous vertebral column.
The earliest iterations of this are the agnatha, the jawless fishes.
They have circular, sucking mouths and mostly act as ectoparasites, but their life cycle is notoriously tragic.
Oh yeah, the notes mention this. Marine adults migrate from the ocean into freshwater rivers, specifically to spawn.
And once they lay their eggs, they die, leaving their larvae to eventually migrate back to the sea.
From the jawless, we graduate to the jawed fishes, which are divided into two distinct, highly competitive classes. First, chondrichthyes, the cartilaginous fishes like sharks and rays.
They are armed with tough placoid scales and a ventral mouth.
But the notes emphasize a massive evolutionary disadvantage. They have no air bladder.
Which means they lack natural buoyancy.
So they just sink.
If a cartilaginous fish stops swimming, it sinks. They have to expend constant muscular energy 24 hours a day their entire lives just to maintain their position in the water column.
That sounds absolutely exhausting. On the other hand, you have osteichthyes, the bony fishes. They have an ossified skeleton, cycloid scales, and protective gill cover called an operculum.
But their absolute game changer is the presence of an air bladder.
They can precisely control their buoyancy and just float in place without trying, like a seahorse.
It's an incredible energetic advantage.
And as we look at pages 14 and 15, the final sections of the notes, we reach the monumental transition where life dragged itself out of the water. The tetrapods.
Class Amphibia, meaning dual life, bridges this gap.
They can survive on land, but they are still fundamentally tethered to the water. They have moist skin without scales, and while they develop lungs, they still require aquatic environments for external fertilization.
But class Reptilia, the creepers and crawlers, completely severed that tie to the water.
How did they manage to conquer dry land so successfully?
It came down to moisture retention and reproductive independence. Reptiles evolved dry, cornified skin with epidermal scales that lock in hydration.
And they shed those skin casts.
Right. More importantly, they utilize internal fertilization and lay amniotic eggs with tough shells.
They essentially package a tiny private aquatic environment for their embryos.
Exactly, allowing them to reproduce in the middle of a desert. They also feature a 3-chambered heart, though the notes point out a crucial exception.
Crocodiles. They have evolved a fully separated 4-chambered heart, allowing for much more efficient oxygen circulation.
Taking that efficiency to the skies, we have class aves, the birds. Their forelimbs are completely modified into wings.
They're warm-blooded with a 4-chambered heart, but flight requires extreme weight reduction. The notes highlight that their bones are pneumatic, meaning they are hollow and filled with air cavities.
Even their skin is dry, lacking any glands except for a single oil gland at the base of the tail used for preening.
Finally, we arrive at our own lineage, class Mammalia.
The defining trait, giving the class its name, is the presence of mammary glands to nourish young with milk.
Other exclusive mammalian traits include hair on the skin, external ear flaps called pinnae, and heterodont dentition. We have highly specialized teeth, from incisors for cutting to molars for grinding.
And we are predominantly viviparous, meaning we give birth to live young.
Predominantly. Because the notes drop one final glorious exception right at the very end. The ornithorhynchus, the platypus.
A mammal covered in fur, producing milk that somehow still lays eggs.
You just cannot put nature into a perfect box.
Never.
So what does this all mean? If you followed along with all of that, you now hold the blueprint to the animal kingdom. What initially looks like a dry taxonomy table is actually a thrilling story.
It is a record of millions of years of rigorous biological problem solving.
Full of shapeshifters, bizarre exceptions, and incredible leaps in engineering.
It truly is. And looking closely at all these adaptations, I want to circle back to that mind-bending concept from the tunicates, retrogressive metamorphosis.
Oh, right, the organism that devolves.
The idea that an organism begins its life as complex, active, and highly developed, but its ultimate, most successful strategy for survival is to shed that complexity, to become sessile, to simplify.
It goes against our basic instincts. We always assume that evolving or growing older means accumulating more complexity, more tools, more overhead.
Exactly. We view evolution as a relentless march toward greater advancement, but the tunicate proves that sometimes stepping backward and drastically simplifying your existence is the most brilliant, efficient strategy imaginable.
It's like a highly stressed corporate executive realizing the ultimate key to survival isn't climbing higher, but retiring to a quiet beach.
It makes you wonder, where else in our own lives or in the modern systems we constantly overcomplicate might deliberately simplifying and shedding our overhead actually be the ultimate key to success?
That is a fascinating thought to leave on. Sometimes less really is more, even in the grand blueprint of biology. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the animal kingdom. Keep asking questions, keep looking for those weird exceptions, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.